Hello, I'm Mighty Alfredo, and welcome to the first episode of Backlog Reviews. In this series, we're going to be taking a look at games that may be in your backlog. Maybe they're a bit older, or maybe they were never the most popular and you aren't sure if they're even worth it. Maybe you skipped over them and they aren't in your backlog at all. The twist is that we aren't going to be looking at these games as being old or underrated gems. Rather, we're going to be looking at the games as if they came out yesterday and judge them on their own merits, and try not to let nostalgia color things. In other words, we are asking the question, is this game worth playing in 2022? This review is intended to be as spoiler-free as possible, but minor spoilers are going to be impossible to completely avoid, so consider yourself warned. Let's get started. Dragon's Dogma was released by Capcom and directed by Hideaki Itsuno, best known for his work on Devil May Cry, in 2012 for the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360. The Dark Arisen expansion released in 2013 and is currently included with the base game. In 2016, the game was ported to PC, which is the version you are seeing on screen. Dragon's Dogma is an open-world action-adventure RPG that takes place in the fictitious duchy of Grancis, a rocky peninsula characterized by canyons, forests, and long grass. The game follows the Arisen, a hero appointed by the very dragon who threatens to raze the entire continent if the Arisen does not face him. If this wasn't motivation enough, the dragon has also quite literally stolen your heart, leaving you with a scar as your badge of office. Not a bad start for the story, although it's worth mentioning that before you learn this, you must complete the tutorial section, which throws you into the role of a past Arisen, just minutes before he faced the dragon. With the premise out of the way, let's begin our backlog review of Dragon's Dogma Dark Arisen. Let's get the technical details out of the way first. The game supports resolutions up to 1440 and frame rates of 30, 60, or variable. The game has a wide variety of options you can tweak to optimize your experience, but realistically, this is a 10-year-old PS3 game, so if you're running on even remotely modern hardware, you should be able to set things pretty high. The game comes with the 1080 HD texture pack pre-installed. Visually, the art direction is fairly simple, but is done in a way that keeps the visuals looking respectable, though certainly not awe-inspiring, in the present day. Enemy designs are reasonably diverse, and the scenic vistas show the environment at its best, with the long viewing distance enhancing the feeling of adventure. That said, armor clipping is a huge issue in this game, and I honestly don't think any effort was made to avoid it. An option to hide capes and cloaks would have helped a lot, but unfortunately we just have to deal with it. Animations are simple, but fluid and readable. Magic in particular has casting animations that border on boring, until the spell is unleashed and the sheer spectacle more than makes up for it. However, the visuals are things that you can see for yourself on screen. So let's move on to the meat of the game. The combat. To start with, this game has a class system, with there being 9 playable classes, or vocations as they're known. Your vocation affects the weapons and armor you can equip, as well as the skills you can use. The vocations are based off melee fighter, nimble rogue, and magic caster archetypes. There are also 3 tiers of vocations: basic, which are the starting ones and are called fighter, strider, and mage; hybrid, which are vocations that combine 2 of the archetypes and are called assassin, magic archer, and mystic knight; and advanced, which are the more specialized versions of the archetypes and are called warrior, ranger, and sorcerer. Perhaps counterintuitively, though I called them tiers, all 9 vocations are intended to be equally powerful. Overall, the individual vocations are very well done. Most of them feel unique thematically and have their own strengths and weaknesses. The exceptions are the strider, which I think lacks a strong identity to distinguish itself from the other rogue vocations, and the mage, which is completely outclassed by every other magic vocation and everything but healing. Speaking of magic, you can't talk about Dragon's Dogma without talking about how great the magic system is. especially with the Sorcerer vocation. Playing as a pure caster is a joy with the mix of risk to reward ratio tools you are given, with the high risk, high reward spells being incredibly satisfying to pull off. I seriously don't know any other game that gets this as right as Dragon's Dogma. If there is, let me know. I want to play it. An interesting wrinkle in the vocation system, however, is that you are never locked into anything. Various NPCs will let you buy other vocations for a small fee, and no vocations are locked behind proficiency in another one. This interesting flexibility does come at a cost, however, and that is the hidden mechanic known as stat growth. Every time you level up, you gain stats, such as health, defense, magic attack, etc., based on your current vocation. Each vocation has a different amount it levels up each stat, though the game never tells you this, or displays the actual values you gain. On one hand, this allows you to min-max your character if you take the time to look up the spreadsheets, build guides, or are paying very close attention to your status screen after every level up. On the other hand, this allows you to make a character that has a bunch of useless stats, because you kept switching vocations and the game didn't warn you. Simply informing the player on how much they would gain upon leveling up would have gone a long way towards allowing the player to make informed decisions, but that's not what we have. A better designed reason to swap vocations can be found in the augment system. Augments are passives that can be unlocked as you gain proficiency in any given vocation, and they can be equipped even if you change to a different vocation. This is a great way to encourage experimentation, though it's not perfect. You can't see what augments exist without having leveled up each vocation first, and leveling up additional vocations is very grindy. I feel it important to note that you aren't forced to swap vocations if you don't want to. You can comfortably beat the game without ever changing your vocation, with the possible exception of the mage, which, while still possible, will be harder due to being dreadfully underpowered. In addition to augments, each vocation has a couple more things that unlock as you raise your proficiency. Core skills are vocation-specific passives that don't take up augment slots. They range from additional fighting techniques to mobility options. They are very effective, though they do feel a bit like a tax, as just not buying them leaves you weaker. Skills, which include spells, can also be purchased and upgraded. Each weapon type your vocation can equip gets 3 skill slots, with the exception of mages and sorcerers, who get 6. Skill variety is very good, and there are very few skills that feel like they're simply an inferior version of another, though there are some skills that are generally more useful. Each skill unlocks for purchase at a certain proficiency level, and can be upgraded one time. The upgrades are generally just buffs or add an extra effect, and so don't change the core functionality of the skill. Other than that, there are no other trees or prerequisites you need to worry about, which makes experimentation pretty painless. Undoubtedly, you've noticed that this is a party-based game. You are allowed up to 3 additional AI companions called pawns. Very early on, you are given the opportunity to create your own main pawn using the same character creator that you used for yourself. Your main pawn progresses much in the same way as your character, and you have full control over its vocations and skills. The exception to this is that pawns are not allowed to be hybrid vocations, though there is actually never a lore explanation for why this is. Beyond the build customization, pawns can also have their AI tweaked by adjusting their priorities, called inclinations, during character creation, at knowledge tiers, and via potions. This is an absolutely fantastic system that really lets you feel in control of how your party operates. At least until their inclinations change due to the battles and you have to retweak them. The other problem with this system is that the inclinations have obtuse names and descriptions, so you'll likely need to use the wiki to know what each of them actually means. The other 2 members of your party are called support pawns. Support pawns are actually the main pawns of other players, with their gear, build, and inclinations preserved. Pawns the same level as you, or lower, can be recruited for free, and the player you are recruiting from will be given a reward by the game. Should you be playing offline, support pawns will be randomly generated, but otherwise work the same way. Though offline, your pawn will never be recruited, which isn't so dissimilar from playing online these days. I do feel the need to take this moment to comment that, while I've ragged on mages quite a bit, having a pawn as a mage works perfectly fine. I, personally, keep one in my party at all times just for the healing they provide. A valid counter to this is that consumables can do the same thing, but better, but I'm personally too lazy to manage my inventory that closely, so I always take the mage. Another interesting mechanic that helps the AI of the pawns function, as well as any AI companions in any game, is the learning system. The gist is that every monster has 3 weaknesses that pawns are programmed to take advantage of once they've seen it once. This means that not only can you teach pawns how to fight, but pawns can teach other pawns as well. Does this mean they're perfect? Well, no, but there isn't really a lot of competition in the good ally AI category. Add to the fact that your pawns can be resurrected for free if they die in battle, and you will experience a lot less frustration with these companions than in most other games. If, however, you really don't want to play with AI, you can do it, though it is significantly more difficult. Simply have your main pawn suffer an unfortunate accident, such as near a cliff, say, and you're good to go. On the topic of difficulty, the game has easy and normal modes that can be swapped between at any time, as well as a hard mode that restarts your story progression when you choose it. Hard mode also has some other differences, primarily with gold, so I would think of it more as a separate game mode intended for people who have completed normal mode. In terms of difficulty on normal mode, while I wouldn't call it an easy game, I also don't think it's particularly difficult. While it definitely takes more skill than a mindless hack and slash, you generally are still allowed to play overly aggressively without worrying about dying on the spot, until you find some of the difficulty spikes peppered throughout. This is actually a little bit more of an issue, as the game can certainly send you through some areas you are not prepared for. One of the more egregious examples of this that comes to mind is an early game side quest that sends you to a destination past some bandits. If you haven't been doing everything you can to gain XP up to this point, and you haven't bought better gear, getting 1 or 2 shot is a very real possibility. That said, most of the enemies and encounters in this game are reasonably well balanced. And equally importantly, the encounters are varied in terms of enemy numbers, types, and the terrain fought on. From time to time, you may need to rethink your party composition, go get better gear or skills, or even change up your attack strategy, but I think that these are reasonable expectations of the player. A few quick final points about combat. You have a stamina bar, which is consumed by jumping, sprinting, grabbing, and throwing. Stamina regenerates over time, and your default light and heavy attacks do not consume stamina. Large enemies can actually be climbed, which is a lot of fun, when the camera works. Finally, healing magic can only heal a portion of the damage you take. Consumables, however, can heal all damage. Using this as a segue, managing your inventory is an important part of both combat and exploration. Every item you pick up, as well as every item you have equipped, has weight, and that weight affects your stamina usage and recovery, with your character's carrying capacity being controlled by the size you made them in character creation. Your character's height also affects their ability to grab high things and avoid some hits, with medium-sized characters being more of a worst of both worlds than a best. The tallest and fattest character you can create is probably the strongest, due to the amount of consumables that they can carry. So let's talk consumables. For our purposes, we're going to break consumables into 2 categories, curatives and tools. Curatives are healing items which can be used at any point, and I do mean any point, from the menu. The game even pauses for you, so you can scarf down 50 plants like the Dragonborn does Wheels of Cheese before you take that hit that would have killed you. Pawns will also use curatives in their inventory automatically. Tools are a bit more broad, and can be buffing items, single-use spell tomes, or other utility items. They also may have a cast or usage animation. Pawns can use some, but not most, tools. There is also a crafting system that you can use to maximize your consumables that is very powerful, but also completely optional. Overall, the combat is the biggest strength of this game. The amount of build variety not only gives the game replay value, but also allows you to mix things up if you start getting bored. The underlying systems aren't perfect, and they can be obtuse and unbalanced, but they are forgiving enough for you to ignore, and deep enough that an ambitious player can use them to great effect. Above all, the combat feels rewarding and tight. And I'll say it again, I don't know any other game that makes being a pure spellcaster feel as fun as Dragon's Dogma. Let's talk about the world and level designs, though we will need to separate the base game and the Dark Arisen expansion, as they are completely different. If I had to describe the world of Gransys in one word, that word would be grounded. This is not your typical fantasy world with poison swamps, fiery volcanoes, frigid tundra, and desert wastelands all within viewing distance of each other. Gransys feels like it could be a real place. Personal preference will determine if you find this to be refreshing or boring, but personally, I appreciate the effort that went into blending the biomes together subtly using things like tree density or changes in the incline of the terrain, and even changes in the strength of the wind. The biggest complaint that I have about the overworld map is that it's too small, or more accurately, too little of it is used. Completing the main quest takes you to a surprisingly small amount of the total map, and the side quests only add a little bit more. The vast majority of the map is completely optional, with only the loot you find as a reward. While this isn't the end of the world, it certainly has wasted potential. Throughout the main quest, you'll enter a number of dungeons. Overall, they aren't particularly big or complex, but each one is unique and memorable, and their size and designs do a great job of making them feel like part of the world. They also feature side rooms and nooks and crannies where you can find consumables, money, or equipment if you're diligent in your exploration. Because it's essentially a giant dungeon, I'm going to slip the part on the Dark Arisen expansion in here. It has quite a different aesthetic from the base game, and would feel right at home in Dark Souls with the whole castles and corpses thing it has going on. The dungeon can be described as having levels, with progression blocking bosses, and shortcuts to the beginning being found every so often. The levels can be further broken down into individual rooms. Unfortunately, the rooms can get quite repetitive, with the same rooms being used numerous times. Honestly, if you were shown footage of a run, you would be forgiven for assuming it was procedurally generated. That said, while I am critical of the number of rooms, the ones that do exist are varied and distinct, showcasing verticality, horizontal mazes, open areas, and a variety of hazards. There are also usually multiple routes through a level, and exploring thoroughly can reward you with very useful items and equipment. Before we go back, I'll also take the moment to comment that the expansion is intended to be played after beating the main game at least once, and is balanced around the player being in New Game Plus. The story also assumes that the player is familiar with the hidden endings of the base game, so if that matters to you, you'll need to study up. Okay, back to the base game. Throughout the world, you'll find various NPCs, with most all of them having some sort of schedule that they keep. Some traveling merchants even travel the entire world. Each line of NPC dialogue is fully voiced, including that of random and unimportant citizens. Even more impressively, there is a diverse cast of voice actors used, so you won't find multiple NPCs using the same voice. Unfortunately, the NPCs are just kind of there. Very few are particularly interesting, even those who have quests associated with them. I believe that this is a big contributor to how empty the world feels. Also, too many of the NPCs you're supposed to like are simply bland, boring, and/or annoying. I find it genuinely hard to care for the so-called important NPCs. Overall, I would call the world and level design a mixed bag, with some high highs, low lows, and a lot of generally good enough in the middle. This isn't surprising given that the game was planned to be much longer, but we judge on what we're given, not what could have been. So we've talked about the combat, we've talked about the world. Let's get into our last big talking point, quests and story. I'm going to break down the quests in Dragon's Dogma into 3 categories: main quests, side quests, and board quests. Main quests are the main story. They are either mandatory or a part of a complete 3 of the 5 following quests type of quest. Side quests are non-mandatory and are given by NPCs. And board quests can be found on notice boards throughout the world. Overall, the main quests are fairly well done. They send you to different areas, they have a variety of objective types, and having choices in which to do is interesting as well. It's also worth mentioning that when you are given a choice of which quests to do, you are able to do all of them should you wish. The biggest weakness of the main quests is actually the story, but we'll get to that. Side quests are very similar to the main quests. There are a nice variety, and they will send you into areas where the main quests don't take you. They can be very easy to miss, however, as many are only active during certain points in the overall story progression. Some side quests are also side stories involving NPCs, so they are worth looking out for. Board quests aren't very flashy. They mostly revolve around killing a bunch of enemies, escorting an NPC, or delivering certain items, but they work well as something to generate extra gold, XP, and rewards. So back to the main quests and the story of the game overall. Without getting too deep into spoilers, the best I can say is that it has some cool concepts. Realistically though, the story is probably better described as a premise, a reason for you to be in the world. It's really more of an excuse to build a world, ask some philosophical questions, and fight monsters. I say this because most of the time you are using Grand Soren as your hub, the quests aren't advancing the story of you and the dragon. They're explaining the political climate, or sending you off to learn tidbits about the history of the world. But these things are not a story in themselves, they're world building. Some people really like to compare this game to Dark Souls for a variety of reasons, the storytelling among them. And while I agree that the type of storytelling and world building that Dragon's Dogma does is certainly in the same vein as Dark Souls, I would argue that it's not nearly as fleshed out. Dragon's Dogma doesn't build a narrative history of the country from the dialogues and item descriptions. The best you get are comments that a particular structure served a particular purpose at some point in time. The most interesting ideas, however, are found in the multiple endings, which, with the exception of one, can be accessed through scenarios where you are presented with two choices. Staying away from spoilers, I would highly recommend seeing both outcomes of every choice before starting the expansion. The last hidden ending is different, and it's impossible to describe without spoilers, so I'll let you find it or spoil yourself. Essentially, this is a game with lore more than it's a game with story. And the lore, while not necessarily going to win any awards, is still very interesting and worthwhile. Alright, before we wrap things up, let's do a rapid-fire listing of other things of note within the game that we haven't talked about yet. First off, there is a way to duplicate items in the game through the use of an NPC that makes forgeries. Most duped items work just like the original, but some important ones will not. However, NPCs will not be able to tell the difference between the two, allowing you to duplicate quest items that you want to keep, though it can lead to some different outcomes of the quests. Do note that these items are expensive, so you can't just duplicate items at your leisure, but it is still certainly an interesting mechanic. The same shop that sells forgeries also sells gimmick weapons and NPC armor. Some of them are garbage, some throw balance out the window. I personally don't use them, but they do exist and they can be quite fun. Fast travel is done with items. You can place up to 10 port crystals in the world and travel to them by use of a fairy stone. Port crystals are rare and expensive tools that can be placed pretty much anywhere in the overworld, in addition to the permanent ones that exist in towns. There are only a few to find throughout the world, but they remain placed when you enter New Game Plus. An eternal fairy stone can be found in your bank and is reusable, a welcome addition from how the game was originally designed, where fairy stones were single use and kind of hard to come by. It can be interesting to explore the world with the consumable ones though, as there is a certain sense of preparing for an expedition that is lost when you know that you can just teleport back if you need to. There is a day and night cycle. Time passes when you are in the field and is frozen while you are in town. Night features more dangerous and more numerous monsters waiting to ambush you. Also, it's really dark, so you're going to want your lantern. Speaking of which, your lantern is very important in this game. This is both fun, as it makes traveling in caves more hectic as you need to keep your lantern dry and full of fuel, and more tedious as lantern upkeep involves lots of extra menuing. You only have one character slot. This is very annoying, as starting a new character means deleting an old one. There are third-party tools to help with this, or you can just do it yourself with moving the save data, but it's rather disappointing that it's not built in. New Game Plus, where you start the story over with all your current equipment and levels, does not change the world or strength of the enemies. You are also forced to play as one of the 3 basic vocations until you get back to Grand Soren, and you can't use fairy stones until that time. I don't actually mind this first part, as I'm not really a fan when developers make large changes in New Game Plus, but not starting the game as the class you beat the game with is kind of weird. So now we can answer the question, is Dragon's Dogma Dark Arisen worth playing in 2022? My answer is yes, but be prepared for an experience that feels slightly flawed or incomplete. The foundations and content that are there are great, and it's honestly hard to find good party-based games that have action combat. Unfortunately, the game is still held back by its bare-bones story, mediocre to bad NPCs, convoluted progression system, and perhaps grounded to a fault world. Added on top of all this is the constant feeling that there is content missing, which there is, as the game that the developers intended to make was likely over twice as large, but had to be trimmed down. However, there is one additional reason why you should consider overlooking these flaws. There have been leaks and rumors that Dragon's Dogma 2 may be on the horizon. The director Hideaki Itsuno himself has mentioned that he has been approached about it, and a sequel may well be better equipped to deliver on the original vision of the game, Hopefully, these rumors are true, as despite all of its flaws, Dragon's Dogma brings a lot to the table that other games simply don't. I'm Mighty Alfredo, and thank you so much for watching my very first video. It was a lot of work to make this, and I'm still not sure I understand what I'm doing. If you could please leave me some feedback, maybe even a like or subscribe if you think it's earned it, it would mean a lot to me. Also, if you have a game in your backlog that you want to see featured here, leave a comment. I'm always happy to take recommendations. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.